You're too poor to understand." The words didn't explode. They didn't need to. They landed softly, almost politely, floating between the clink of crystal glasses and the low murmur of a room that had never known discomfort. But something about them lingered longer than they should have, like a note slightly off-key in a perfectly rehearsed symphony. And for just a second, the room slowed. Emily Carter stood beside the table, pen hovering just above her notepad, her posture straight, composed, unshaken. If anyone had glanced at her in that moment, they would have seen nothing unusual. No flinch, no forced smile, no tightening of the jaw, just stillness. But her eyes, quiet, observant, shifted ever so slightly toward the man who had said it. Daniel Whitmore. A name that didn't just carry weight. It created gravity. He sat at the center of the table like he belonged there, like the room itself had been arranged around him. His navy suit was tailored with surgical precision, his cufflinks catching the warm light each time his hand moved, each gesture deliberate, controlled. Daniel didn't raise his voice when he spoke. He didn't have to. People leaned in anyway. Around him, his guests responded exactly as expected. Soft laughter, approving nods, the subtle choreography of agreement. Men who managed funds large enough to shift markets. Men who spoke in percentages and projections the way others spoke about weather. And yet, none of them questioned what had just been said. Because in rooms like this, hierarchy is understood before words are spoken. Emily moved again. Not away, just enough to finish placing a glass of water at precisely the right angle, her movements fluid, efficient, almost invisible. She adjusted a fork by half an inch, straightened a napkin. Everything exact, everything controlled. She didn't belong to their world. Not on paper. Her world was measured differently. In hours, not quarters, in shifts, not portfolios, in quiet precision that no one noticed unless it failed. And she never failed. Behind her, Daniel continued speaking, his voice smooth as aged whiskey, cutting cleanly through the ambient noise as he outlined a deal. Complex, layered, designed, not just to succeed, but to impress. Numbers floated through the air like currency itself. The equity release aligns with projected growth. We minimize exposure through conditional structuring. It's airtight. A few of the men nodded immediately. Of course it was. Daniel Whitmore didn't bring ideas to the table unless they were already winning. He leaned back slightly, fingers resting against the stem of his glass, confidence settling over him like a second skin. Then, almost as an afterthought, his gaze flicked briefly toward Emily again, just long enough to remind the room of something unspoken. Some concepts, he said slowly, a faint smile forming at the edge of his lips, are just beyond certain people. The table responded right on cue. Soft laughter. Not loud, not cruel, just enough to reinforce the line that had already been drawn. And this time, Emily paused. It was subtle, barely noticeable, her hand resting lightly against the edge of the table as she set down a cup of coffee. Steam curled upward between them, thin and delicate, like a veil separating two entirely different worlds. She didn't look offended, didn't react the way anyone expected. No sharp inhale, no defensive glance, just a moment of stillness, as if she had heard something more than what was said, as if beneath the polished confidence and rehearsed authority, she had already noticed something else. Something small, something hidden, something no one else at that table had seen. She stepped back. The room moved on, or at least it tried to, because just before she turned away, her voice slipped quietly into the space between them. Soft, measured, unmistakably clear. Sir. It didn't interrupt the room. It cut through it. The numbers don't align. Silence didn't fall all at once. It crept in, slow, deliberate, like something testing whether it was allowed to exist there. Daniel stopped mid-sentence. Not dramatically, just enough. His hand, which had been mid-gesture, lowered slightly, fingers resting against the table as his eyes shifted toward her, not with anger, not with immediate dismissal, but with calculation. The kind that built empires. The kind that dismantled people. For a second, he simply looked at her. Really looked. As if trying to place something that didn't quite fit. Because waitresses didn't do this. They didn't interrupt. They didn't sound certain. And they definitely didn't challenge structure in a room like this. One of the men across the table let out a quiet chuckle, shaking his head as if to brush it off. Guess we've got an analyst on staff now, he muttered. A few smiles followed. Relief laughter. The kind people use to restore order. But Daniel didn't laugh. Instead, he leaned back slightly in his chair, expression smoothing into something controlled, polished, almost polite. The version of himself he used when he was about to dismantle something piece by piece. That, he said evenly, voice calm but edged with precision, is a bold statement. A pause, especially from someone who hasn't seen the full structure. A few nods around the table. Authority reestablished. Order restored. Or so it seemed. Because Emily didn't move. Didn't retreat into the safe invisibility expected of her. She didn't step forward either. She simply remained. Her gaze dropped briefly, not submissively, not uncertainly, but with purpose, toward the document resting near his hand. She didn't touch it, didn't overstep, just observed. And then she spoke again, softer this time, but sharper. Page 12, she said. Section 7.3. The silence this time was immediate. No clinking glasses. No shifting chairs. No quiet laughter. Nothing. Because specificity doesn't belong to guesswork. Daniel's fingers paused against the edge of the paper. For the first time that evening, his confidence didn't disappear. But it hesitated. Just slightly. Just enough. And in a room like this, that was everything. One of the investors leaned forward, curiosity replacing amusement. What exactly are you implying? He asked. But Emily didn't look at him. Her attention remained exactly where it had always been. On Daniel. As if the conversation had narrowed to just the two of them. The clause ties your equity release, she continued, her tone steady, almost clinical, to a conditional performance metric. A faint frown appeared on someone's face. Trying to follow, trying to catch up. But she didn't slow down. And that metric, she added, is controlled by a third party with discretionary authority. The room tightened. If they delay certification, even by 90 days, she said quietly, your liquidity window closes. No one moved. And the controlling interest shifts. This time, there was no laughter. No dismissal. Only the sound of Daniel Whitmore's breath, slow, measured, as he leaned forward, eyes scanning the document again. More carefully, more precisely. The rhythm he had carried all night, fractured. Not loudly, not obviously, but undeniably. The room shrank around that moment. Because this was no longer a passing comment. This was no longer something that could be brushed aside. And yet, Emily didn't press, didn't emphasize, didn't wait for recognition. She simply stood there, composed, as if the truth didn't need help being heard. And for the first time that evening, Daniel Whitmore didn't speak. He read, carefully, slowly, and somewhere between the lines he thought he had mastered, something began to shift. Daniel Whitmore didn't react immediately. That, in itself, was the reaction. The room had already learned to read him, not through what he said, but through what he didn't. And right now, he wasn't dismissing her. He wasn't laughing. He wasn't correcting her. He was thinking, and that was far more dangerous. The silence stretched just long enough to make everyone uncomfortable. Not visibly. No one shifted too much. No one broke posture. But beneath the surface, something subtle had cracked. The easy rhythm of the evening, the smooth confidence that had carried every word Daniel spoke, it was no longer seamless. It had resistance now. Friction. Daniel's fingers rested against the edge of the document, unmoving, his gaze scanning the lines she had pointed out. Slowly, carefully, as if the page itself had changed in the last 30 seconds. But then, he leaned back. And just like that, the room exhaled. Because whatever hesitation had appeared, it was gone. Or at least, that's what it looked like. A faint smile returned to his face. Not the warm kind, not the polite kind, but the controlled, deliberate one he used when he was about to regain control of a situation. Interesting, he said quietly. Not impressed, not convinced, just interested. His eyes lifted to Emily again, studying her now with something sharper than before. No longer dismissing, no longer overlooking, measuring. You're suggesting, he continued, his tone smooth, precise, that a structure reviewed by my legal team, by external consultants, by people who do nothing but this, has a flaw. A pause. Subtle. Calculated. And you saw it in what? His gaze flicked briefly to her notepad. A few seconds. A soft murmur rippled through the table. There it was. Pressure. Not loud. Not aggressive. But undeniable. Emily didn't respond immediately. She didn't rush to defend herself, didn't fill the space with explanations. She simply stood there, composed, as if the weight of his question didn't require urgency, which, somehow, made it heavier. One of the investors leaned forward, folding his hands together on the table, his voice lighter but edged with curiosity. I mean, that's quite a claim, he said. You're essentially saying we all missed something that you caught while serving drinks? A few smiles appeared again, not mocking this time, but skeptical, because now it wasn't just about hierarchy, it was about credibility. Another voice joined in, sharper this time. Do you even understand the full model? A man at the far end asked, raising an eyebrow. Or are you just pointing at something that sounds complicated? A low chuckle followed, not as confident as before, but enough. The crowd was shifting, testing her, and Daniel watched all of it without interrupting. Because this was where most people folded, not under direct attack, but under layered doubt. Emily remained still. Then, calmly, she spoke. I understand enough. No defensiveness. No attempt to over-explain. Just a statement. Simple. Contained. And somehow, that made it worse for them. Daniel's smile thinned slightly. He leaned forward again, elbows resting lightly on the table, his attention now fully locked onto her. Not dismissing. Not amused. Engaged. Enough, he repeated softly. That's a vague standard. His voice lowered, just enough that the room leaned in again. Let's be precise. There it was. The shift. Not just pressure anymore. A challenge. If you're right, he said, tapping the document lightly with his finger, then you're not pointing out a minor oversight. Another tap. You're suggesting a structural vulnerability. The room went quieter, because now, it wasn't theoretical anymore. Now it had weight. Financial weight. Reputational weight. Daniel tilted his head slightly, studying her reaction. If what you're saying is accurate, he continued, then it doesn't just affect timing. A pause. It affects control. No one spoke, because everyone at that table understood exactly what that meant. Control wasn't just important. It was everything. Emily didn't move, didn't react to the escalation. If the certification is delayed, she said, her tone steady, the equity release stalls. She met his gaze now, directly, and the leverage shifts to whoever controls the certification timeline. The words landed clean, precise, no excess, and the room felt it. One of the men frowned, leaning closer to the document now, trying to follow the logic. Another reached for his phone, as if instinctively wanting to check something, but stopped halfway. Because this wasn't his place to verify. This was Daniel's table, Daniel's deal, Daniel's control. And right now, Daniel hadn't confirmed anything. He studied her for another second. Then, slowly, he sat back. Again. But this time, the smile didn't return. Instead, he reached for his glass, taking a slow sip, his eyes never leaving her. You're confident, he said. Not a question. An observation. Emily didn't respond. Didn't nod. Didn't need to. That alone was an answer. Another investor cleared his throat, attempting to reset the tone. Even if that's true, he said carefully, there are safeguards in place. Extensions. Legal protections, not in this clause. Emily's voice didn't rise, but it cut through him anyway. He stopped, mid-sentence. And now, the room shifted again. Not toward Daniel. Toward her. Because she wasn't arguing emotionally. She wasn't guessing. She was certain. Daniel set his glass down. Gently. Deliberately. Then he did something no one at that table expected. He turned the document. Toward her. Not fully. Not offering it. But opening the space. Then show me, he said. The words were calm. Controlled. But unmistakable. A direct challenge. If you're going to interrupt a room like this, he added, his tone now edged with something sharper, you don't get to speak in generalities. A pause. Be specific. The tension tightened instantly. Because now, there was no middle ground. No room for vague insight. No safety in ambiguity. This was exposure. One of the men leaned back, folding his arms, a faint smirk returning. Here it comes. Another whispered under his breath. Let's see how far this goes. The crowd was no longer neutral. They were watching, waiting, some curious, some skeptical, some quietly hoping she would fail, because that would restore the order they understood. Because if she was wrong, everything would snap back into place. Emily stepped forward, just slightly, not rushing, not hesitating. Her eyes moved to the document, scanning it with the same quiet focus she had carried all night. No dramatics, no performance, just attention, pure, uninterrupted. Daniel watched her closely now, not as a distraction, not as an anomaly, but as a variable he hadn't accounted for. And for the first time, there was no assumption in his gaze, only observation. Seconds passed, longer than they should have, long enough for discomfort to settle in again, long enough for the room to feel the weight of the moment. Then she spoke. Here. She didn't touch the page, didn't point, but her voice anchored exactly where it needed to. The certification authority isn't bound to a fixed timeline. The room stilled. It's discretionary, she continued, which means delay isn't a breach. Daniel's eyes dropped to the line. Reading, following, tracking. And without a defined enforcement clause, she added, you don't trigger any penalties. A beat, which means you don't trigger your release window. Silence. No movement. No sound. Just the quiet, unmistakable realization spreading through the room. Something was off. Not confirmed. Not yet. But close enough to feel. Daniel didn't speak. Didn't react. But something had changed. Not visibly. Not dramatically. But internally. And everyone at that table felt it. Because this was no longer about a waitress speaking out of place. This was about a possibility they hadn't considered. A risk they hadn't priced in. A flaw that shouldn't have been missed. Daniel's fingers tightened slightly against the paper. Not in anger. Not in frustration. But in focus. And for the first time that evening, he didn't look like the man controlling the room. He looked like the man. Daniel Whitmore didn't argue. That was the first sign something had changed. In any other room, with any other person, he would have dismantled the claim instantly, pulled apart the logic, redirected the conversation, reasserted control before doubt had time to breathe. But he didn't. He looked at the clause again. Longer this time. Slower. As if the words had weight now. As if they resisted being skimmed. The room watched him. Not openly. Not obviously. But everyone felt it. Because when a man like Daniel Whitmore pauses, people notice. One of the investors shifted in his seat, clearing his throat as if to fill the silence, but stopped halfway. No one wanted to be the first to speak. Not until Daniel did. His thumb brushed lightly against the edge of the page, tapping once. Then again, a rhythm that wasn't nervous, but deliberate. Thinking. Calculating. Then finally, he reached for his phone. The movement was small. Controlled. But it landed harder than anything that had been said so far. Because this was not part of the script. A man at the far end leaned forward slightly, brows tightening. You're calling someone? He asked, trying to keep his tone casual. Daniel didn't look up. Yes. Just one word. Flat. Precise. Final. And suddenly the air in the room shifted again. Because Daniel Whitmore didn't verify things publicly. He didn't need to. His confidence was usually enough to carry decisions forward. But now he was checking. And everyone knew it. Emily didn't move. Didn't react to the escalation she had just caused. She simply stepped back half a pace, returning to stillness as if her role in the moment had already been fulfilled, which only made her presence heavier. Daniel raised the phone to his ear. No hesitation. No delay. The line connected quickly. Review the equity release clause, he said immediately, his voice lower now, sharper. Page 12. Section 7.3. A pause. He listened. The room held its breath. No one pretended not to care anymore. One of the men leaned closer to another, whispering under his breath, but even that felt too loud in the silence. Daniel's eyes stayed fixed on the document, his jaw tightening just slightly, not visibly enough to signal concern, but enough to signal focus. Specifically, he added, the certification authority. Another pause, longer this time, and something subtle began to happen. The room, once centered around him, started orbiting something else. Uncertainty. He shifted slightly in his chair, his fingers no longer tapping, now still against the table. Listening. Processing. Then, he asked a second question. Quieter. More deliberate. If certification is delayed, what happens to the release window? Silence. No one moved. Because everyone already knew what answer he was hoping for. And more importantly, what answer he feared. The voice on the other end spoke. No one else could hear it. But they didn't need to. Because Daniel's expression didn't collapse. It didn't crack. It didn't reveal panic. It did something worse. It changed just enough. A stillness. A micro shift. The kind that only happens when certainty is replaced by realization. And in a room built entirely on certainty, that was seismic. One of the investors leaned forward, unable to stop himself now. "What did they say?" he asked. No response. Daniel didn't answer. He didn't even acknowledge the question, because he was still listening, still confirming, still letting the truth settle in fully before reacting to it. And when he finally spoke again, it wasn't to the room. It was into the phone. "Is there any protection clause?" A beat. Another answer. Short. Final. Daniel closed his eyes for half a second. Not in frustration. Not in defeat. In recognition. Then he ended the call. No explanation. No transition. Just a clean, controlled movement as he lowered the phone and placed it gently on the table. And just like that, the silence became absolute. Because now, everyone knew. Not the details. Not the full structure. But enough. Enough to feel the shift. Enough to understand that something had gone very, very wrong. Daniel didn't speak immediately. He didn't need to. The absence of his voice carried more weight than anything he could have said. Across the table, the same man who had laughed earlier now sat completely still, his fingers interlocked, gaze fixed on the document as if it might rearrange itself if he stared hard enough. Another reach for his glass, then stopped, halfway. No one wanted to be the first to react. Because reacting meant acknowledging it. And acknowledging it meant, she was right. Emily remained where she was. Unmoved. Unchanged. As if the outcome had never been in question. Daniel lifted his gaze. Slowly. And for the first time that evening, he didn't look past her. He looked at her. Not as background. Not as interruption. But as something that had just altered the trajectory of a decision worth more than most people in that room would admit out loud. "You saw that," he said. It wasn't a question. It wasn't even disbelief. It was something closer to recalibration. Emily met his gaze for a brief second, then lowered it again, not submissively, but simply because she didn't need to hold it. "I've seen similar structures," she replied. Her voice was the same, calm, measured, unaffected. But now, the room heard it differently, because now it carried proof. One of the investors exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. "That's," he started, then stopped. "That's a major exposure." No one disagreed. No one corrected him. Because the illusion had broken, Daniel leaned back in his chair. Slower this time. More deliberate. As if the space he occupied needed to be redefined. His eyes dropped back to the document, scanning it again, not for confirmation anymore, but for consequences. And in that moment, power shifted. Not loudly, not dramatically, but undeniably. Because control isn't just about having answers. It's about believing you already do. And that belief was gone. One of the men attempted to recover the room. "We can fix this," he said quickly. "Amend the clause, renegotiate." "Yes," Daniel interrupted. Calm, even, but final. "We can." He closed the document. Not aggressively, not dismissively, just decisively. And when he looked up again, something had changed in his expression. Not weaker, not uncertain, just different, more precise, more aware. Because now, he wasn't operating on assumption. He was operating on fact. And that fact had come from someone he had dismissed minutes earlier. The irony wasn't lost on him. He turned his head slightly, eyes returning to Emily. And this time, there was no distance in it. No hierarchy. No dismissal. Only recognition. "You should have led with that," one of the investors muttered, half to himself, still trying to process what had just happened. Emily didn't respond. Because she hadn't led. She hadn't entered the room to prove anything. She had simply seen something. And said it. Daniel studied her for another second. Then something unexpected happened. He smiled. Not the polished version. Not the controlled one. A smaller one. Quieter. Real. And for a man like him, that was rare. "Interesting," he said softly. But this time, it meant something entirely different. He reached for his glass again, taking a slow sip, eyes never leaving her. And the room followed his gaze. Because now, they weren't looking at a waitress. They were looking at the person who had just caught something none of them had. The hierarchy hadn't disappeared, but it had been disrupted. And disruption changes everything. Emily turned slightly, as if preparing to return to her work. As if the moment had already passed. As if she had no intention of staying in the spotlight she had just created. And that unsettled them more than anything else. Because most people would stay, would explain, would expand, would claim the moment. She didn't. She stepped away. Calmly, quietly, leaving behind a table full of men who suddenly weren't as certain as they had been 10 minutes ago. Daniel watched her go, not distracted, not confused, but focused, because now he wasn't thinking about the deal anymore. He was thinking about her, and more importantly, about what else he might have missed. The room didn't recover. Not really. Voices came back, carefully, cautiously, men attempting to rebuild momentum with revised terms and safer language. Words like adjustment, amendment, timing window floated across the table, but they didn't land the same way they had earlier. Because now, everything had to pass through doubt first. And doubt had weight. Daniel Whitmore sat at the center of it all, quieter than before, his fingers resting lightly against the closed document in front of him. He wasn't disengaged. He wasn't withdrawn. He was recalibrating. Every instinct he had built over years, every pattern, every shortcut, every assumption that allowed him to move faster than everyone else in the room, had just been interrupted. Not by a rival, not by a consultant, but by someone he hadn't even considered part of the equation. His gaze lifted, not toward the men still talking, but across the room. Emily Carter moved between tables with the same quiet precision she had shown all night, refilling glasses, clearing plates, adjusting details no one else noticed, as if nothing had happened, as if she hadn't just exposed a flaw that could have cost millions. That contrast stayed with him, because in his world, value announced itself. It demanded attention. It made itself known, but hers didn't. It operated without permission, without recognition, without noise, and that unsettled him more than the mistake itself. A voice cut through his thoughts. "We should loop legal back in first thing tomorrow," one of the investors was saying. "No reason to rush this now." Another nodded quickly. "Agreed. We tighten the certification clause. Add enforcement. This becomes manageable." Manageable. The word echoed faintly in Daniel's mind, because it wasn't just about fixing the contract. It was about understanding how it had been missed in the first place. He reached forward, reopening the document slowly, eyes scanning the same section again, not searching for the flaw anymore, but for the reason behind it. Why it hadn't stood out. Why it had blended in. Why he hadn't seen it. His gaze moved line by line, precise, focused, and then it clicked. Not dramatically, not like a sudden revelation, but like something quietly aligning into place. The clause wasn't hidden. It wasn't buried in complexity. It wasn't disguised. It was ordinary, structured cleanly, written with confidence, surrounded by strong, well-built logic. It didn't look like a risk, because it wasn't designed to. It was designed to be ignored, not through deception, through assumption. Daniel leaned back slowly, the realization settling in fully now. He hadn't missed it because it was difficult. He had missed it because he hadn't been looking for it. Across the table, one of the men was still speaking, trying to restore direction. "We've all seen structures like this before," he said. "It's not unusual." "No," Daniel interrupted, quietly, but with absolute clarity. "It isn't." The man stopped, mid-sentence. The room shifted again, because this time, Daniel's voice wasn't asserting control. It was stating truth. He closed the document again, more deliberately now, his attention no longer divided. "They didn't hide it," he continued, his tone measured, almost reflective. "They placed it where no one would question it." A pause. Inside something that already looked correct. No one spoke, because everyone at that table understood exactly what he meant. They had trusted the structure, trusted the pattern, trusted their own familiarity with it. And in doing so, they had stopped looking. Daniel's eyes moved back across the room again. To Emily. She was at another table now, speaking softly with a couple seated near the window, her posture relaxed, her attention fully present. Not watching him, not waiting, just working. And suddenly, he understood something else, something deeper. He pushed his chair back slightly, the sound cutting through the low conversation at the table. "I'll review the revisions myself," he said. No debate, no discussion, just a decision. The others nodded quickly, relieved to anchor themselves to something familiar again. Daniel taking control, Daniel leading the next step. But he wasn't finished, because this wasn't just about the deal anymore. He stood, not abruptly, not dramatically, but with intention, and without another word. He stepped away from the table. The movement didn't go unnoticed. Eyes followed him as he crossed the dining room, past conversations that now felt distant, irrelevant, until he reached the service station where Emily had just returned, aligning plates with quiet efficiency. For a second, he didn't speak. He simply watched. Not the way he had earlier. Not evaluating. Not measuring. Observing. As if seeing her clearly for the first time. Then, Emily. Her name, spoken without hesitation. Without title. Without distance. She turned. Calmly. No surprise. No anticipation. Just acknowledgement. Their eyes met. And this time, there was no hierarchy between them. Only clarity. Daniel held her gaze for a moment longer than necessary, as if confirming something unspoken. Then he asked, "Where did you learn to read contracts like that?" The question wasn't sharp. It wasn't challenging. It carried something else now. Respect. Not fully formed. Not openly expressed. But present. Emily didn't answer immediately. Not because she didn't know, but because she was deciding how much to give. And then, from reading them, simple, direct, unembellished, Daniel almost smiled. Not because it was evasive, but because it was precise. It revealed nothing. And yet, it was entirely true. He nodded slightly, absorbing that. Then his expression shifted again, more thoughtful now. "You didn't hesitate," he said. "You didn't check anything. You just saw it." Emily met his gaze briefly. "They weren't looking for it," she replied. The words were quiet, but they landed harder than anything else she had said. Because they weren't about the contract. They were about the room. About him. Daniel exhaled slowly, leaning one hand against the counter, his mind turning over that idea. Not looking for it. He had built his entire career on seeing what others didn't. On identifying patterns. On anticipating risk. And yet, tonight, he had done exactly what he accused others of doing. He had assumed. An assumption was blind. His eyes moved again, not to her this time, but inward. Reconstructing the moment. The conversation. The confidence he had. Carried into it. The way he had spoken, not just about the deal, but about her. "You're too poor to understand." The memory surfaced uninvited. Clear. Sharp. Unavoidable. And for the first time, it didn't sound like authority. It sounded like error. Daniel straightened slightly, his posture shifting, not in defense, but in acknowledgement. "I misjudged you," he said. No qualifiers. No justification. Just truth. Emily didn't react. Didn't accept it. Didn't reject it. She simply let it exist. Because it didn't change anything. And somehow, that made it more real. Daniel reached into his jacket, pulling out a card. Not casually. Not as a gesture of habit. But deliberately. He placed it on the counter between them. Not pushing it toward her. Not insisting. Just leaving it there. "If you ever decide this isn't where you belong," he said, his voice calm, steady, "call me." There was no arrogance in it. No assumption that she would. Just an offer. Clean. Open. Emily glanced at the card briefly. Then back at him. Her expression didn't change. But there was a pause. Subtle. Considered. As if weighing something that wasn't visible. Then, she looked away. Back to her work. The card remained where it was. Untouched. Neither accepted, nor refused. And Daniel understood. Because for the first time that night, he wasn't trying to control the outcome. He was recognizing it. He gave a small nod. Almost imperceptible. Then turned. Walking back toward his table. But not quite the same man who had left it. Because this time, when he sat down, he didn't speak immediately. Didn't resume the conversation. Didn't assert direction. He simply looked at the document again. Then at the men around him. Then at the empty space where certainty used to be. And for the first time in a long time, he chose something different. He listened. The conversation ended, but it didn't conclude. Not in the way rooms like that usually did. There were no firm handshakes. No confident agreements sealed over dessert. No quiet celebrations disguised as next steps. Instead, there was hesitation. Measured. Controlled. But present. Daniel Whitmore sat at the table, the document in front of him no longer a symbol of certainty, but a reminder of something far more uncomfortable. He had been wrong. Not loudly. Not obviously. But in a way that mattered. Around him, the others gathered their things, voices lower now, careful, recalibrating. Someone mentioned legal revisions again. Another suggested delaying the deal entirely. Daniel didn't interrupt. Didn't take over. Didn't reassert control. He simply listened. And that, more than anything else, changed the room. Because for the first time, Daniel Whitmore wasn't leading the conversation. He was learning from it. Minutes later, the table emptied. Chairs slid back. Jackets were adjusted. Phones checked. The night resumed its rhythm. But Daniel remained seated for a moment longer. Still, quiet. His fingers rested lightly against the table, not tapping, not calculating, just present. Then finally, he reached for the check. A small, ordinary gesture. But even that felt different now. He glanced at the total briefly before placing his card inside. Not as a display of wealth, not as habit, but simply as completion. Something that needed to be done. Nothing more. When Emily returned, her steps were the same as before. Precise, calm, unchanged. She didn't look at the number, didn't react to the amount, didn't acknowledge the shift that had unfolded just hours earlier. Because for her, nothing had shifted. And somehow, that grounded everything. She placed the receipt in front of him. Whenever you're ready, sir. Her tone was soft, professional, untouched. Daniel picked up the pen, paused, then signed. But instead of sliding the folder back immediately, his hand remained there, resting against it as his eyes lifted to meet hers. You saw it immediately, he said. Not a question, a realization. Emily didn't rush to respond. She never did. They weren't looking for it, she said quietly. The same words. But now, they landed deeper. Because now he understood them. Daniel nodded slowly. Not in agreement, but in recognition. Because the truth wasn't just about the contract. It was about attention, about assumption, about the dangerous comfort of thinking you already understand something before you even look at it. He closed the folder and slid it toward her. Then, almost without thinking, his gaze dropped briefly to the card. Still there, still untouched. He didn't reach for it, didn't comment on it. Because now he knew why. Emily didn't need an opportunity. She already had something far more valuable. Clarity. And clarity couldn't be offered. It couldn't be bought. It couldn't even be taught easily. It had to be chosen. She turned to leave. Just like before. No hesitation. No attempt to extend the moment. No need to define what had happened between them. And this time, Daniel didn't stop her. Because this wasn't a moment that needed to be held. It was one that needed to be understood. Outside, the night air felt different. Cooler. Sharper. Cleaner. Daniel stepped out of the restaurant. The city stretching endlessly around him. Lights reflecting off glass towers. Cars moving in quiet precision. The world continuing exactly as it always had. But something inside him had shifted. Not his power. Not his position. Not his influence. Those things remained untouched. But his perception, that had changed. He stood there for a moment, still, watching the reflection of the city in the window beside him. And for the first time in a long time, he questioned something he had always trusted. Not the numbers, not the structures, but himself. Because understanding wasn't about how much you knew. It was about what you chose to see. Back inside, Emily Carter continued her shift, refilling coffee, clearing plates, moving through the room with the same quiet rhythm that had defined her all night. To most people, she was invisible again, just part of the background, just another waitress, just someone passing through their evening without leaving a mark. And maybe that was the point, because not everything that matters announces itself. Not everything that holds value demands attention. Some things simply exist, waiting for the right person to notice. Hours later, the restaurant closed. Lights dimmed, chairs stacked. The noise faded into silence. Emily untied her apron slowly, folding it with the same care she gave everything else. As she reached into the pocket, her fingers brushed against something. The card. She paused, just for a second, then took it out, looked at it. Not with excitement, not with hesitation, just awareness. A name, a number, a possibility. She could call. She could step into a different world. A world she clearly understood. A world that had just invited her in. But instead, she slipped the card back into her pocket. Not rejecting it, not accepting it, just choosing not to decide. Because not everything worth understanding needs to be owned.